Welcome back. This might be the most important lecture I've given on this channel so far. It's certainly like probably the most important concept you could possibly learn in debate, whether you're a beginner or you've already done, 20, 30, 40 tournaments. This is the one thing that I think all PFers sort of universally pretty much can improve on dramatically, and it's weighing. So just to start with the basics, what is weighing? Weighing is just comparing the arguments at the end of the round, or really throughout the round, just in case their arguments are also true. There's basically like two strategies that you can use to win a debate. Either one, you prove that all of your opponent's arguments are wrong and your arguments are true, or at least one of your arguments is true. And then intuitively, if they're wrong and you're right, then obviously you win. This is sort of like I feel like this is the way that people think about debate when they first join the activity. And for a lot of people, it's still the way that they think about debate, even after they've done it for a long time. I know for me, for example, like the concept of doing anything other than this was completely foreign to me, even into like my sophomore year of debate, maybe even into my junior year to some extent. I feel like most of the rounds that I did, especially like the more technical rounds, like it was all about reading as much terminal defense as possible on their case, basically beating all of their arguments, proving that they're all wrong, and making sure that our arguments are well defended and stay true by the end of the round. But this is only one way that you can win a debate, and the much more common way that you win a debate is when you're not able to prove that all of their arguments sort of categorically are just incorrect. But they're also not able to do that to your arguments. So what happens is some of your arguments are correct by the end of the round, and some of their arguments are also correct by the end of the round, maybe to varying degrees, maybe not as correct as they initially were, made to seem at the very beginning in the case, but somewhat correct. And so then the round comes down to comparing those arguments, which one is more important, which one really is a better place for the judge to vote. And this is how I have voted in probably 95% of the debate rounds I've judged. And I've judged like 300 or so. So that's a lot of debate rounds that come down to just comparing arguments that are true to varying degrees. Weighing can be done at any time of the round. It can even be done in constructive. I've read some cases that have weighing in constructive, literally saying like this is the most important issue in this debate, but it's most important really in the back half of the round. So the summary and the final focus speeches. If you're not doing weighing in the summary and the final focus, it's a very bad sign. And unless the opponents are not really doing weighing either, or there's some crazy thing where you are just demolishing them on the flow, you are very likely to lose. Just in general, a recap, the back half formula for summary and final focus speeches is basically you should pick a piece of offense. You should pick an argument that you think is quite good, explain it again, defend it, and compare it. And all of these terms, they have debate jargon. It's just like collapse, extend, frontline, and weigh. And so it's sort of a necessary component of this four-step process that any summary of final focus speech should follow when it comes to extending your own offense. And it's really the most important because if you don't do this, like you're doing all of this work for basically nothing. And I'll explain that in a few slides. One of the biggest reminders I have to give students about weighing is that it has to be comparative. This is sort of obvious, right? It seems to flow directly from the definition of weighing, which is comparing your arguments. But a lot of the time, students don't actually make their weighing very comparative. So what I mean by that is one way that you can, make it seem like you're comparing your arguments is if you explain why your impact is incredibly large, or conversely, you explain why their impact is incredibly small. But really, neither of these things is weighing without the other one, because in a vacuum, you're just saying that your argument is big or their argument is small, but you need to actually do the work to compare the two and say your argument is bigger than their argument. And this isn't always done, even in very high level rounds. Like what you'll see, for example, is people will say, oh, well, my war scenario kills millions and millions of people, and it also could trigger like these other downstream impacts, which makes it the biggest impact in the round. But they're not explaining anything about the other impacts. It's not in the context of the impacts that you are actually comparing against on the other side. And so it's definitely not really as good as other weighing. It maybe arguably it's not even really real weighing in the first place. And the way to think about this is like, it's sort of obvious, right? Your job with weighing is to say that your impact or your argument is a better place to vote than your opponent's. And so inherent in that is that like the ER, right? It's better than your opponent's. It's like, even if you say that your impact is much bigger than you originally said it was for some reason, like you massively inflate the importance of it, that doesn't matter unless it's bigger than your opponent's impact, right? Because otherwise, even if it is bigger than was originally, if it's still smaller than your opponent's impact, it will still lose. And the same is true for things like impact defense, right? Even if you say that your opponent's impact is very small, if it's not smaller than your impact, then it really doesn't matter. Like actually does not change the outcome of the round at all. And so the only way that you can possibly change the outcome of the round with weighing is by being comparative with it and including an explanation of both your argument and theirs in the weighing. It's a basic thing. Lots of coaches teach this over and over again, but it's an important reminder, maybe especially for beginners. The last like tip that I'll give before I actually dive into like all of the nitty gritty with weighing is certainly the most important thing in debate. I explained this earlier, but there are only two ways to win. Approach one is whack-a-mole, right? It's like you have to disprove every single one of your opponent's arguments. But it's really difficult to do that. Like, what if they have 10 arguments and they didn't collapse in first summary, and suddenly you have 3 minutes to extend defense on every single one of their arguments? That's like impossible, right? Like, they're going to have good front lines to one of them. They're just going to choose an argument that you messed up on. Maybe you conceded an argument accidentally, or your responses just weren't very good. They were pretty light on one of their arguments. So it's incredibly difficult just in terms of like a pure time efficiency aspect. Even if all of their arguments are incorrect, it's incredibly difficult to prove that they're all incorrect in the span of a debate round. Instead, it's much easier, I think, to sort of cast a wider net or like an insurance policy, just in case one of their arguments does slip through. And that's what weighing gets you. It's just like so much more efficient. Why would you try to play whack-a-mole with all of their arguments, risking one of them getting through, when you could just cast a wide net and just outweigh all of their arguments with your one argument by the end? So it is an infinitely more efficient strategy for going about winning. And the other way that you can think about this is like, it is an entirely necessary strategy for going about winning, because if you don't do weighing, technically, right? Technically, you within the confines of the debate, if you haven't compared between the arguments at all, then you might as well just run like a 0.1 impact scenario, right? Like, if we pass this policy, it will cost $1,000. Because this would have the exact, like, if you're not comparing anything, on face, this has the same weight as any other argument. The strategy that you're using to win the round on this argument is basically the same. Like for neg, you don't even need an argument. You just win on presumption, right? The AF has some burden to prove that there's some good thing that comes from the policy. And so this whack-a-mole strategy is tantamount to just trying to win on presumption every time if you're not weighing. Because the absence of weighing in the context of the round, technically, without judge intervention, it makes your impact like basically zero. Like you can only win if your impact is the only thing left standing at the end, which seems just like incredibly silly, I think. Like, why would you ever do that when you would probably have a much easier time actually explaining the full weight of your impact compared to theirs, just in case some part of their argument slips through. So that's just a way to think about it that explains why weighing is so important. The next part is, this is sort of getting more into the point of this lecture, which is everything in debate is weighing. Basically everything in debate is weighing. Like the debate itself, 100% weighing. The reason for this is because there's technically only 3 possible functions in an argument in terms of how it can contribute to you winning the round at the very end. Because we should be thinking about the end of the round instead of just thinking about speeches in isolation. This is sort of trivial, but why are you giving a good rebuttal if that good rebuttal is not helping you win at the end of the round, right? Then it's not really a good rebuttal, is it? So there's only 3 possible functions of an argument. One, it's an argument, right? It's a way that you could win by the end. It's offense. Two, it could be terminal defense, as in you could be erasing an argument from the flow. This is 0% true. It's just an incorrect argument, and so the judge does not consider it at the end. Or three, it's weighing. And the important thing is there's no in between. There is nothing else. Anything that is not one of these three, it doesn't really contribute to you winning at all, right? It can't possibly do anything to help you win. And so, in other words, apart from terminal defense and setting up the offense originally, like the actual gameplay of debate, because offense is sort of like putting your chess pieces on the table, the actual gameplay is entirely weighing. And I would go even a little bit further here and say it's sort of entirely weighing, even when we consider different kinds of defense, because there's not really such a thing as terminal defense. Maybe in like the crazy technicalities of debate world, we can imagine such a thing as terminal defense. But in reality, it seems like it's impossible to prove that any argument is 0% true. It's impossible to prove that any argument is 100% true, but it's also impossible to prove that any argument is 0% true. Think about it, right? Like, it could be true. There is evidence of it being true, given that they read a card that says maybe it could possibly happen, or they thought of it in the first place. Like, there's some logic behind it. If we get even like more extreme, the fact that you can conceive of this argument seems like sufficient evidence to prove that there is a 0.0000001% chance of it being true. Even if you have like 10 pieces of conceded terminal defense, it's not really terminal. Like, okay, there's still a chance it could happen. There's still a chance that your defense is incorrect. We should doubt all of these things, but that also means we should doubt the defense to some extent. And so there's not really any such thing as terminal defense. This is especially true when we consider the actual arguments that people are reading in debate rounds. Like the vast majority of debate rounds should not have any terminal defense because authors write about arguments that definitely could be true, even if it is very unlikely that they are. The fact that it is unlikely that they are, or that there are reasons why it is incredibly unlikely, is not sufficient to prove that it is impossible for this scenario to happen. It's just like an impossibly high burden of proof that you would have. So that means that all of debate is just weighing between arguments, and there is nothing else. You set up arguments and then you compare them, and that is everything. And when I say it's everything, like, I do literally mean it's everything. For example, we'll talk about how evidence and frontlines, everything that you could possibly put in debate that is not itself offense is weighing or sets up weighing in some way. There's one tangent before we get there, which is like, okay, I said there's no such thing as terminal defense, but maybe technically there is if we're considering like the completeness of arguments, right? Like, I made another lecture about how you can make missing pieces into responses to arguments. Like maybe they have no warrant for why this argument is true. And then in the technical confines of debate land, maybe that means that this is like technically terminal, right? If there's no argument to begin with, like if they get up and they say contention 1 is blah, 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 and then contention 2, probably you can't vote for contention 1, even if there's no response to it or something, because it just is not an argument. There is not something to vote for. There is not offense in the first place. So I guess technically that is terminal defense, but it seems just like a little bit of a different thing, right? Like this is an observation that there was not offense to begin with, not so much a new argument you're introducing that causes the offense to be erased, if you get me. So I still think there's no such thing as terminal defense. Okay, how does everything fit into this claim? Because I've made a very sort of a broad claim that everything is weighing except for independent offense itself, which is the thing to be weighed. So what about evidence? Because evidence itself is not independent offense, right? It sort of supplies support for offense, or maybe it supplies the foundations for offense. Claim 1 is you can have offense without evidence. This seems true, right? There are analytical turns and stuff that people read all the time. You could imagine a constructive that has 0 cards in it that could still technically win a round. Like maybe it is unlikely that it wins a round, but that's not because it doesn't have the potential to win. It's not doomed from the very beginning because there's no offense. It's maybe doomed because the opponents are likely to read carded responses, and then it's difficult to weigh against that or sort of compare the truth value against something that is an expert. But it still has offense in it. So we know that offense does not require cards, which means that cards themselves are not a sort of a necessary condition for offense. They must be something else. They must be sort of like a magnifier of offense. But if they're a magnifier of offense, that just means they're weighing, right? Why are you magnifying the offense except to make it magnified more than your opponent's offense? That sounds a lot like just comparing your arguments, which is weighing. And in fact, that seems to be what all of the functions of evidence are. They're just different proxies for comparing the arguments later in the round. They set up for these comparisons later. So for example, there are kind of four technical functions of evidence that I identified. Maybe you can think of more. One is like some smart person said my claim, and this is why the evidence is in my case, because it supports my claim. I think this is the least important function of evidence, but it seems to be relatively common. But why could this possibly matter? Like if you compare an argument where a smart person did not say the claim against an argument where a smart person did say the claim, but they have all the same parts, like the same warrants, the same impacts. The only reason why the smart person saying the claim would make it a better argument is because maybe it's more true, right? And more true is like the key word, right? More is the key word. More true than what? Then the argument otherwise would have been, well, sure, but why does that matter? It only matters if it's more true than the argument on the opposing side, as in it is outweighing the argument on the opposing side in some sort of truth value, maybe like on probability or something, right? So it seems like this function of evidence is basically just probability weighing. Second function of evidence is maybe you have an empirical study or you have an example of where your argument happened in the past. Now, this one's interesting because I think sometimes the function of examples is not necessarily like increasing the credence of your argument or increasing the likelihood that it is true. Sometimes the function of an example is like illustrating the argument, right? Like explaining it a little bit more by showing how it happened in the past. And in this case, it's more like you're trying to explain the warrant to the judge using an example. A thought experiment is a sort of thing that would do this. But a lot of the time it's used to provide empirical backing for the argument. But why does empirical backing matter? Because it makes it more true. So this also just seems like probability weighing. You could get away with offense without the empirical study, but you add the empirical study so that you can make sure that it is easier for you to have a high degree of truth in this argument by the end of the round, higher perhaps than your opponent's arguments. The third function of evidence is uniqueness. This is when people ask, like, how could you possibly make offense without evidence? This is usually the thing that they're referring to that maybe is missing, is you don't have like a factual basis of what the current status quo looks like. I still think you don't necessarily need that. Like clearly there are logical reasons why something can go up or down from any point that it is currently at in the status quo. Because it's very difficult to prove that, like, again, there's no terminal defense, right? So it's difficult to prove a terminal non-unique. But uniqueness would help you disprove a terminal non-unique anyway. It would help you at least, like, let's take a non-unique to be mitigatory, right? The function of a non-unique is to say, hey, look, that change isn't actually that big because most of it is already happening. But again, most of it is already happening. It's impossible to prove that all of it is already happening. Even if you have a card that says all of it is already happening, like, okay, the card might be true, right? There's like a 99% chance the card is true. So even this is mitigatory. So then the function of uniqueness, of having very strong uniqueness, is sort of to reverse this, right? Say, no, actually, there is a very large gap between the status quo and the world of the affirmative in the context of my impact, which means it is not so small, it is actually quite big. So you're cutting back against this sort of mitigation in a way that looks like maybe magnitude, I think, like the amount of change that's happening between the two worlds. That seems like magnitude to me. So there's a bigger change between the two worlds with regard to our impact. Bigger than what? Bigger than the change with regard to your impact, which means this is sort of magnitude weighing. And the last one is quantification. This is the other thing that people wave to when they, suggest that evidence is completely necessary. Is like, how could you possibly compare your impacts? We need numbers, right? because that's the most objective metric that we can use to compare impacts. I'm sort of skeptical of this. Like maybe numbers are helpful, but you could certainly imagine that a war would be very bad and cause a lot of casualties, even if you don't have a card that says exactly how many. But granted, yes, like quantification is obviously very helpful, but it's helpful in what? It's helpful in comparing the numbers and comparing the magnitudes of these terminal impacts, which means it is helpful in weighing. So all of the functions that evidence could possibly have technically, besides just like making the judge like your argument more, which doesn't seem very technical to me, all of them are weighing. It's all weighing all the way down. Okay, what about front lines then? So if all of the responses, like all of the defense that you have in rebuttal, that's all mitigation. And mitigation only matters if it helps you with weighing, right? Why would you possibly, let's say you make a response that their argument is half as big as they said it was originally. But if half of their original argument is still bigger than your biggest argument, it's not going to matter by the end of the round. Like it does not change the judge's decision whatsoever with regard to weighing. And so it only matters that you're mitigating their impact if you are bringing it down to a level where it is easier to overcome with your own, aka if you are reducing it to a state that is easier to outweigh. So it supports your weighing. And along the same lines, that therefore, like responding to defense, defending your own arguments, frontlining, is also weighing. It's just sort of in the reverse. It's recovering some of the probability or the magnitude, maybe, or whatever aspect of your argument is being used to compare. So responding to defense only matters because it can make the difference when it comes to weighing. For example, if we have that same scenario as before, if they give a response to your argument, they say that it's half as big as you originally said, and half of your argument is sufficient to outweigh their biggest argument still, you should not waste time responding to the mitigation, right? Like it cannot change the outcome of the debate unless some other crazy variable is happening that you're trying to account for. But if that's all there is, you are literally wasting your time if you frontline the defense, because even with the defense, conceding the defense entirely, it does not change the weighing because the defense is not sufficient to allow their arguments to overcome yours. So you should only frontline when it makes the difference in weight. Okay, more weighing stuff. This is all weighing stuff. I don't have good transitions between the slides, but reasons to prefer are sort of the bread and butter of weighing when it comes to comparing arguments, especially at like the warrant level. But you should compare everything. Again, I said everything is weighing. This also implies that everything needs to be weighed. And when I say everything, again, I literally mean everything. So you should know probably that when you read a turn on an argument, you should weigh the turn, right? Just because you're reading a turn does not mean that the argument goes away. Some turns, yes, they have defense embedded within them, but that still doesn't mean that the argument originally that was there is erased. Again, there's no terminal defense. The defense embedded within turns is also not terminal, which means that you're still comparing two arguments. In this case, it happens to be two offensive arguments that are maybe linking into the same impact. If you're trying to steal their impact, it's a little bit different if you have an impact turn. And this clearly needs to be compared, right? Impact turns are maybe the even more obvious case. If their argument is that this will cause a recession and your impact turn is that a recession is good because it like stalls climate change, which is more important, you need that more important part at the end for this to be a viable argument in the first place, right? Otherwise, they're just going to be like, I guess, but the economy is more important. And then your impact turn loses to the weighing on the impact calculus. So clearly turns, whether they be linked turns or impact turns, they need to have reasons to prefer. For example, if you're making a link turn, let's say we're talking about like pharmaceutical profits. I feel like this is a pretty textbook example. Their argument is that pharmaceutical profits will go down and this will hurt R&D. Your argument is that actually affirming the resolution increases pharmaceutical profits. And you both have a reason why this is true. They have some reason why the policy reduces profits. You have some reason why the policy increases profits. You clearly need some way to compare these, because just because you have a reason, you've provided a reason why actually maybe they increase, you still haven't defeated their reason why it decreases. And even if you read defense on it, even if you say that's not true, it still might be, right? So you should compare against it, just in case, and also maybe including the version that is mitigated by your defense. Like the fact that you have defense on it is a reason to prefer your turn, for example, but you should have other reasons to prefer your turn as well. So the better version of this linked turn is like, look, they say that profits decrease. We have an argument that profits actually increase. Here are like 3 or 4 reasons to prefer our conception. The next part, hopefully this expands your mind a little bit. You can weigh defense, and you should weigh defense. Again, the fact that there's no such thing as terminal defense also implies that you should explain the implication of your defense with regard to how much it mitigates their argument. But also, you should compare your defense against their warrants for their offense. Here's just a sort of a different way to look at defense for a second. They say there is a reason why pharmaceutical profits decrease. You say there is a reason why pharmaceutical profits do not decrease. And unless this reason is a direct negation of the original reason, as in unless you're responding to the specific warrant, which is actually quite rare, you need to give reasons to prefer your defense over the original warrant. Because otherwise they could just turn around and say, yes, there is a reason why pharmaceutical profits do not decrease, but there is actually a better reason why pharmaceutical profits do in fact decrease. And here are like 3 reasons to prefer our warrant over their counter warrant or over their mitigation or defense or whatever it might be. And so you should always compare basically any defensive argument against the offense that it is, trying to apply to in the first place. This also means that a viable way to defend your case is just using your case against the defense. The most obvious example of this is like evidence, right? People will use empirics to sort of just shotgun through defense. They'll be like, look, they have 4 responses. They have 4 reasons why this should not be the case. We have 1 reason why this should be the case. So to tie break it, just look at the empirical evidence, and the empirical evidence accounts for all of their defense. And it says that even so, even if the defense is correct, on net, it still does happen. Our 1 warrant is actually more powerful than their 4 counter warrants. And so we are correct, they are incorrect, even if all the defense is true. But you should do this even if you don't have evidence. Like you can do this with just logic. Like here are reasons why our warrant is likely to be more true than their counter warrants when you consider the real world or something. I'm not 100% sure what that would look like. It's probably case by case, but it's a very important thing to think about because people don't do this. And I think it makes rounds way easier. It makes it much less scary to, for example, make a mistake and concede a piece of defense because you could just be like, okay, yeah, I did concede your defense, but you also conceded my original warrant, and we can compare between those. And then the last one is maybe more obvious, which is comparing evidence, right? There's lots of different ways that you can compare evidence. Recency, ours is more new, matters sometimes. Credibility matters rarely, I would say, but sometimes you get evidence that's like very, very, not credible at all. Bias is sometimes important. Methodology is a better one, like, correlation versus causation, or like there's this reverse causal. Ours isolates all the variables. That stuff is a little bit better. It's actually very rare, though, that 2 studies just blatantly contradict each other. More often, you have 2 studies that sort of are maybe supporting different claims, right? Like your study could lend support to a claim, and their study could lend support to the opposite claim. But those studies themselves are not actually contradicting, in which case the better way to compare them is actually like which study more directly supports the claim or counterclaim, which piece of evidence is more relevant to the actual discussion that we're having. Okay, now here's an interesting thing. Let me know if you think this is true, because I have sort of always thought that this is a weird quirk of technical debate. But it might be that I have this totally wrong and everyone else is on like a higher plane of thinking when it comes to the flow. But at least in my experience and in my discussions with other people, it seems like there's this weird thing that's happening when people think about the order of arguments as they are read on the flow. So I'll give you an example here. Let's say the pro-constructive on the Somaliland topic says, for some reason, I don't know why they're doing this, they have defense in their constructive before the con even, or before the neg even reads any of the offense that this is responsive to. They say, just as an observation to their case, there will not be backlash if the African Union recognized Somaliland, and they have two warrants Y, or three warrants Y rather. Warrant one is any backlash will be a double-edged sword because there are lots of costs of things like war and sanctions. They go both ways. So that will deter them from wanting to do it. Number two is that the US will support the African Union's recognition of Somaliland. They have some warrant for why that's going to be the case, and this will deter backlash. And number three is that the African Union itself is a pretty powerful organization, and so there's sort of a fear of anyone who might backlash that they would have to run into this organization that might fight back in some way or defend the interests of Somaliland. And so there will not be backlash. In the rebuttal, the neg stands up and they respond to this observation. And they say, actually, this is incorrect. There will be backlash for two warrants. One is that Somalia will backlash because they have very strong incentives to backlash. It's like an existential threat to their sovereignty and their legitimacy if they don't. And they have a capacity to do so. Like China gave them guns. So they have guns that they can use to like invade Somaliland or something. And number two is that Egypt will backlash. They also have an incredibly strong incentive because they support Somalia. They want to deter other independence movements that might harm their own sovereignty. And they have a good capacity to do so because they have like a very high military capability. They have a strong economy and they have a lot of regional allies that will allow them to do this. And then if there's backlash from either one of these actors, it's going to be a huge impact that constitutes offense for the neg. Then in the summary, or what it may be in like this, I don't know what the next speech would be, the frontlines, this, I guess the summary, yeah. In the summary, the AF says, actually, you've conceded all of our warrants. You've conceded that the costs of backlash are incredibly high, which means that there's net negative incentives. You've conceded that the US will deter them, and the US is incredibly strong, which means there's no way they have the incentive and the capacity to do this. And you even conceded the African Union will deter this, which completely destroys their incentives and capacity. But then the neg stands up in their summary, and they're like, no, no, no. You've conceded that Somalia has incredibly high incentives and all of the means that they need to do this backlash, which is enough to overcome any of this hypothetical deterrence that you talk about. And you completely conceded that there's massive incentive and capacity for Egypt to help out and also do their own independent backlash, which is also enough to overcome deterrence. Like maybe this is an existential threat for Somalia, right? And so even if there is a possibility of deterrence, there's strong enough incentives and capacity for Somalia to do this. You've completely conceded this mechanism. It's over for you. Yeah, whatever. We have super good offense here that can win us the round. So I wonder, like, I have a few questions for you, the viewer, just to think about here. One, who is winning this on the flow? Like, let's say this is, for some reason, this is the last speech, or it continues back and forth, literally exactly like this into Final Focus. And you're judging this round. Like, who do you vote for? Is it just a deadlock, or are you more sympathetic to one side or the other, and why? And yeah, that's the second question. It's like, why do you think that? And the third question is like, does your intuition on this change if we flip the flow? So for example, now it's, the same arguments. In this case, the neg is running backlash. They have two subpoints. They're both, it's about backlash. Subpoint A is Somalia has strong incentives and capacity to backlash. Subpoint B is that Egypt has the same. The pro-rebuttal gives three pieces of what they call terminal defense. They say, number one, impossible. There are massive costs of war and sanctions. Number two, impossible. The US will swoop in and deter any aggressors. And number three is the African Union is very strong and they will deter any backlash. And then the neg just says, they sort of just extend through ink, I guess. They just say, extend subpoint A. Somalia has huge incentives and they have huge capacity to backlash. Extend subpoint B. Egypt has huge incentives and capacity to backlash. And the AF says, oh, but you dropped that there are massive costs that destroys incentives and capacity. You dropped the US deters them, which is terminal, and you dropped the African Union deters them. So who's winning now? And really why? Like, what makes the difference? What really makes the difference? Because my intuition here is from at first glance, if I'm looking at this flow, I think the the con is winning this one narrowly because at least they said like because it seems like it's weird that the pro sort of dropped the two scenarios. They didn't even touch them at all. Maybe they had like an opportunity to respond more specifically, but instead they just extended the original responses, which sort of seems to be through ink. But it's only through ink if you consider the two responses to be accounting for or responsive to the three warrants why it's not true. So it's weird, but I lean a little bit con here, or just deadlock. And this one, I feel like it's very clear that the pro is winning, that the ath is winning. I don't know why. It seems like yeah, there's three pieces of pretty good defense that are just sort of dropped. Maybe it's like the way that the neg is extending, like they're not. It doesn't seem like it's accounting for the ath defense as much. But I actually think that even if they did like supposedly account for it a little bit why does that matter that much? Like, it's really just a very slight difference in wording of the extension. I'm not convinced that there's anything like meaningfully different about the arguments between these two flows. So I don't really know why I have this intuition, but I definitely do, and I feel it somewhat strongly. Like it feels like a cognitive bias in my head that's difficult for me to check against. It's just like whoever like had more of an opportunity to respond, or whoever has the last word here is more correct. But it really, I think it starts earlier, right? Like whoever seems to be making more of a mistake when they're responding to the rebuttal, um, maybe is more at fault. I don't know why though. But I think this gives a good example of how clearly we need something more. Because technically it seems like both of these are just in that deadlock. There aren't any reasons to prefer the offense over the defense or the defense over the offense. So I think this demonstrates very clearly why you need to actually give reasons to prefer, even if it's defense, right? Like you can't just give three responses like number one, cost of sanctions is high. Number two, US will deter. Number three, African Union will deter, which is what like 90% of PFers do this, right? 90% of PFers do this. But in my opinion, if the neg extensions is just slightly better and accounts a little bit more like this, it's not clear that that's enough. I think you need something extra that actually accounts for the original warranting in the constructive. Um, so yeah, this just sort of illustrates my point here. I think this is very important. I think this is sort of this meaningfully should change the way that you debate going forward. Because I really think like 95% of rounds fall into this trap. So yeah, food for thought. All right, next part of this lecture. Now we're gonna get into some controversial stuff. Let's talk about weighing mechanisms. What are weighing mechanisms? Weighing mechanisms are just different ways that you can compare how good of a voter your argument is compared to their argument. There are a lot of weighing mechanisms. People have come up with different weighing mechanisms for years and years and years. We've imported some from other debate events. We've imported some from sort of like academic literature. And so we have this whole pot of different tools that we can use to compare arguments. And this is what a lot of people get taught at camp. So if you need to compare your arguments, you should think of one of these things. Magnitude, our argument is bigger. Scope, it affects more people. Severity, it hits them harder, right? Sort of like someone dying is much worse than someone stubbing their toe, for example. Losing $10,000 is worse than losing $1,000. That's like severity kind of thing. Time frame, it affects them sooner. There's another one, duration affects them for a longer amount of time. Sometimes people group these together and call them time frame because they both have to do with time. But I think it's useful to separate them. Probability, our argument is more likely, or our impact is more likely to happen. There's more, right? Like reversibility, it can't be reversed as much. The classic example is like death. Strength of link, they didn't respond as much as we responded, or this argument is conceded, so it has 100% strength of link. You can use that for weighing. Clarity of impact, clarity of link. I guess it's more clear. Their argument is like their impact is like democracy. Who knows what that actually means? Our impact, you know exactly what it means. It's like 10,000 people die tomorrow. Uniqueness. It's more unique. Their argument it happens a little bit on both sides, but our argument it only happens on one side. Otherization. It affects more marginalized groups, or it leads to more marginalization. My favorite one is Jaredization, which is that my friend Jared, he likes our argument more. Um, yeah, the problem with this, it sort of it sort of becomes absurd because let's say team A, they're outweighing on uniqueness and clarity of link and strength of link and scope. And team B is outweighing on time frame and probability and duration and also otherization. These are just words. Like who wins? This is not really actually comparing arguments. So yeah, the controversial hot take here. I think weighing mechanisms are a bunch of baloney. I think it is sort of a lazy way to compare arguments that doesn't really involve that much brain power. And it's not really comparing arguments. It's like which boxes can we fit our comparison into the most, and then we slap that name tag on it, call it a day, we win. But it's like it's not decisive. It's not decisive at all. And just because you said magnitude doesn't really mean magnitude. Uh, I don't know. I don't know. I have a lot of issues with weighing mechanisms. I think they're quite lazy. Um, so why are they weird? Why do I have issues with weighing mechanisms? The first one is because it's really tough to know like what some of these weighing mechanisms even mean or why they matter. Why they matter is the bigger one. Like, who cares if your argument comes quicker? Like, why is that a weighing mechanism in the first place? Like, let's say my argument is bigger and it's more likely, and yours comes quicker. It's like your argument is that someone is going to lose half of their money, and my argument is there's going to be like a nuclear war. And your argument, it's so much quicker. It happens as soon as you affirm. My argument happens in like a year after you affirm, but it's definitely likely. It's definitely bigger. Why in the world do I care that yours comes quicker? Like it doesn't seem to actually make a huge difference to me. Why is that sufficient for me to think that your argument is a better place to vote? I don't think it is. And so there seems to be this big gap between like these weighing mechanisms are attempts to say our argument is a better voter. But I think even if you win the weighing mechanism, it doesn't prove that your argument is a better voter. So like some of these weighing mechanisms seem like they just don't matter at all. So we need to fill that gap, connect it to actually proving the claim that your argument is a better place to vote. And the way that we can do that, I think, most intuitively, is connecting it to one of two things. It's really important if it happens, or it's more likely to happen. I think that's all there really is in consequentialist sort of calculus, risk calculus, we can say. I think it is entirely just magnitude and probability, and every other one of these weird words, I think it's just a proxy for one of those, or like an internal link into one of those concepts. Time frame, for example. Let's say it comes quicker. Well, one reason that that might matter is if it does come quicker, and this is also like urgency, right? Stop using your fake weighing mechanisms. If it does come quicker, maybe this makes it more likely, right? In the war scenario happening in a year, we don't really know if it's going to happen in a year. A year is a long time. Lots of things could change. The world, we move fast. We change things all the time. And so the conditions that you say will cause the war in a year might actually be totally different. Our predictions are not completely great, and they're definitely like exponentially worse as time moves forward. And so maybe our ability to predict the way that this scenario will happen, or if it even happens in the first place, is sort of hamstrung by the very long time delay between passing the AF and the scenario manifesting. Then, okay, that seems like probability. Another way that you can use this fairly commonly is like people use this against climate, like warming scenario impacts, where they say, yes, this is a huge magnitude, but the fact that like the emissions that we release today, they only actually contribute to warming in 20 years. There's like a huge lag. it means that we have 20 years to find more solutions to make it less bad. This is not necessarily probability, like it's still going to happen, but maybe this is more magnitude. Like we have more time to adapt to your impact scenario, which means that it will kill fewer people, it will be less bad, and so there is an internal link to magnitude. But without one of these, like I'm just not convinced that time frame is a weighing mechanism. And so it's not just that time frame like could be useful because it's an internal link into magnitude or probability. It's that it's only useful if it's an internal link into probability or magnitude. All of the other ones follow the same logic. Scope, how many people are affected, that's just magnitude. We'll call magnitude is just the importance for the sake of this lecture. So amount of people, that seems like it's more important. That's magnitude. Strength of link could be like a filter on the probability, right? Like if your argument is conceded, presumably it's more likely to be true. If their argument has a lot of defense on it that says it's not very likely to be true, then again, this is sort of an easy one to say this is just in the probability category. Reversibility sounds a lot like magnitude, right? Like someone dying, you can't get them back. But if you go into poverty, you can get out of poverty. Well, if you go into poverty, but you can get out of poverty, that means maybe there's less of a duration of the impact, which means that it hurts people less. That sounds like magnitude to me. So an easy sort of like way to think about this is we only care about how important it is as a voter, and that just means how big it is times how likely it is to happen. So risk, we can call this importance like risk, right? This is what's used in the literature. Like existential risk papers use this sort of calculation, where risk is like magnitude, how big it is, times probability, how likely it is to happen. And magnitude can be further subdivided into like scope times severity times duration. Maybe there are some weird things happening with like people dying. Like, well, what's the duration on that? Is it forever? I don't, or is it zero? I don't know. It's like kind of hard to think about. But in general, this is a pretty good way that you can think about the calculation. And what's notable here is that like all of these things matter to the eventual, like how important this is as a ballot on your flow. And it's not that one of them trumps another one. Okay, tangent, probability weighing. I just said everything is magnitude and probability. But half of this seems suspicious, and that's the probability half. You might have heard people say this: probability weighing is not real weighing. It's just sort of, it's poor debate. It's not actually weighing, it's just more defense. It's just someone trying to win on the flow and calling it weighing. It's not weighing. And it makes sense, right? The logic behind this is that in order for something to be called weighing, it needs to be assuming that the opponents are correct about their argument. After all, weighing is like an insurance mechanism, right? If our argument is true and your argument is true, who wins? So you have to assume that their argument is true for an argument to even be weighing in the first place. Whereas defense is like they're wrong about their argument, right? They're incorrect about something, or it's not true, or it's not completely true. So weighing that depends on defense does not seem to be weighing because it's not assuming that that your opponents are correct. Or at the very least, it doesn't sort of carry the same strategic value as weighing, right? Because the whole point of weighing is that you don't have to play whack-a-mole. But if your weighing depends on your responses, then you are still playing whack-a-mole. You are still relying on defense entirely to win the round. The next problem is like if you win it on the flow, it seems true for the debate, right? So if your weighing is contingent on your defense being true, I can just answer your defense. Defense is no longer true, so your weighing is no longer true. So it seems like it's too dependent on the line by line. And if the opponents just win their argument, which they should be doing anyway, then the probability weighing sort of just goes poof, it just goes away. So if people just frontline properly, which happens in most rounds, then they just end up having high probability by the end, and you're not really doing weighing. So the conclusion here is that probability weighing is fake. This is not true. This is also baloney, okay? I am here to tell you probability weighing is true. It's real weighing and it's good weighing. Um, and here's why. Probability weighing is great. If you win an argument with frontlines, true, you do have 100% strength of the link. That is true. The probability of your argument is exactly as likely as you originally said that it was. This is the same thing that happens if your argument is completely conceded, right? Um, so if I give 0 responses to your argument, you have as much probability as you originally had when you first read the argument going into the round. It does not decrease at all. But strength of link is not the same thing as probability. It's sort of like a limiter on probability, right? Like you can have lower strength of link, in which case your probability goes down, but having higher strength of link doesn't mean your probability goes up. Like you have a starting point that's not 100%. And strength of link, you start with 100% strength of link, which means you start with your starting point probability times 100%, but not like times 2. Like it doesn't go up because you don't have defense against your argument. So there's another component here that people are missing, which is like the inherent likelihood of the impact happening. I'll give you a few examples. The easiest example here is about curing cancer. Let's say my argument is, let's say we're debating a silly topic for practice. We're debating about whether or not schools should have homework. And my argument is that schools should have homework because if schools have homework, then more kids will learn STEM education, which means we'll have more people who become doctors. And one of those doctors will likely cure cancer. It's much more likely if we keep homework than it is if we remove homework. We'll pretend that this is conceded. There are like a bunch of responses they could have given, but they didn't give any of them. I think it's silly of me to say, like, then start weighing cancer against all of their arguments and saying it is 100% true. Like it seems like there's something about curing cancer that doesn't have 100% probability. And this is more obvious if we use a link that's worse. Like let's pretend that we're debating a different topic and there's like a massive link chain to get to curing cancer. It's like if we have better FAA regulations and flights are less likely to crash. Well, you know who takes a lot of flights? Doctors. The best doctors take the most flights because they have to fly between different hospitals and different medical schools. And if doctors are crashing in plane crashes, they might die. And a doctor who cures cancer might be on that plane. And so my impact is cancer. Obviously, even if you concede this argument in its entirety, like you don't even say anything about it, you can still say later in the debate that it's not that likely that there is a doctor who might cure cancer who is on a plane that crashes in the absence of a higher degree of FAA regulation. Again, I don't think this is a crazy technical leap. I think this is quite intuitive, and it's an inherent component of the argument. You don't start with 100% curing cancer. You start with some unknown percent. Maybe it's more known if you quantify it with evidence. I doubt a lot of evidence can quantify that, but maybe you have evidence that like there's a 10% chance that a doctor will cure cancer in the next 10 years or something. But it's very difficult to quantify those probabilities. Even so, even though it's difficult to quantify them, they still are not 100%. You don't get to be lazy and say, oh, it's hard to quantify them, so it must be 100% true. Just completely illogical. And unfortunately for PFers, the same thing applies to most impact scenarios that you're reading right now. Actually, all impact scenarios that you're reading right now, but some more than others. So nuclear war is a very obvious example. Just because nuclear war could happen doesn't mean that it will. So for example, lots and lots of people, they have an impact to a war starting or some conflict happening. And then they have some internal link card that immediately hops to nuclear war. But it doesn't mean that every conflict will cause nuclear war, right? Clearly, right? We've lived through conflicts that have not caused nuclear war, even though they could have drawn in great powers, or they did draw in great powers who are nuclear armed, and there could have been miscalculation, but there just wasn't. the probability might have been very high. Cold War, for example, like we almost had nuclear war, but we didn't. It's not 100% probability just because your argument says that it could happen and no one responded. 100% chance and 0% chance predictions are both impossible. So terminal defense is not possible, but also 100% chance is also not possible. This is really obvious when you consider election scenarios too, right? Like lots of people were reading arguments about how XYZ policy is more likely to get Harris elected or Trump elected. But again, like the argument you're reading says that the probability goes up, not that it goes to 100% from zero, right? So even if I concede your argument and say that you're right, you don't get access to 100% probability of this person getting elected and 0% probability that they otherwise would get elected. This is just sort of nonsensical. And it's really obvious. Like I'm surprised I even have to explain this, but people sort of are debating with this assumption right now. But obviously, right? Like your authors do not say that it will happen. They say that it might happen, or that it could happen, or that it's possible. And even if they did say that it will happen, I don't believe them. They're probably wrong. No one has that predictive capacity. We don't have like these omniscient, like fortune-telling people in our society who know with 100% certainty what's going to happen. Even if we're talking about like causation and stuff, like it's not a given. Tomorrow, everything will be different, potentially. We don't know. So this leads to actual weighing that is very important that we should think about. For example, if I make the argument that impact turn your war scenario, you say passing the AF will lead to a conventional war and thousands of people might die. Tens of thousands, whatever, big impact. I say, yes, it will lead to a war. There is a high likelihood that this war will be so bad that no one will go to war anymore after it happens because everyone will see that this is such a bad war, and so they won't go to war anymore. Let's say you concede this argument. I don't think it's over for you. Okay, let's say you are absolutely make a terrible mistake, or like your partner doesn't know how to debate and they didn't respond to this in summary. They just extended the original impact. They ran out of time. They missed this impact turn at the very bottom. It is silly for me to stand up in the next speech and say, it is GG. They can't respond anymore. We outweigh on scope because they have conceded that their war can end all of the future wars that would happen instead, which means that we on net save more lives and we turn their impacts or something. Because you can just stand up in the next speech and say, yes, we did not respond to your argument because it is true. This war could stop other wars from happening with some probability, but you have conceded that this war is like incredibly likely. And we can just say that those other wars, it is unlikely that they are stopped, or it is unlikely that they happen in the first place, or some other sort of combination of probability weighing. And I don't think this is a new response. I don't think it's a new response. Like lots of people, they see this and they're immediately like red flag, like new defense, not allowed. It's not defense. It's like an observation of the argument you originally read, which is that there are other wars, each of which might have a lower probability as a result of this war, which is true. I can just say, yeah, that's completely true. You win the scope weighing because maybe the next 100 wars will have a slightly lower probability. But if we're comparing, like, let's say this war has a 90% probability, and each of those next 100 wars, they each are reduced by like 0.1% as a result of this war. I don't know. Then I still can outweigh just on probability. And this is just a thought experiment. It probably wouldn't work that well in an actual round. But I just want to prove to you, like logically speaking, probability weighing does work. It can win you a round, and it doesn't have to be contingent on new responses. But it can be contingent on responses. In fact, I think that the other premise of this argument that, weighing only is weighing if you completely agree with their argument to its full extent is also not true. I've been telling you this whole lecture, right? Defense is weighing. We just need to talk about some distinctions between types of weighing. because it's true. It's worse weighing probably when you rely on more premises that could be proven false, when you rely on more responses, when you rely on more defense. Um, and so we can introduce a new concept, a concept of charity that I think explains this pretty nicely. All arguments exist on this spectrum. All arguments that you use to compare, so all weighing, I'll put defense in here too because people see them as distinct things. But weighing and defense, as I've been saying this whole time, are they're fundamentally the same type of argument. And this is an extra way that we can kind of show that, I think, while also explaining how they function and how you can have better weighing. So there's kind of two sides to this continuum of charity, this line that I've drawn. You can either be very uncharitable. You can say all of their arguments are super small. They're way smaller than they said they were. They're way less true than they said they were. So they're not as good as our arguments. Because again, this only matters if it allows you to do this comparative. If you're saying that their arguments are way smaller than they said they were, and your arguments are still smaller than those smaller versions, it doesn't actually make a difference at all. And so you will still lose. This only matters if it exactly makes the difference. If without this defense, you wouldn't be able to outweigh it, and with this defense, you are able to outweigh it. So they're not as good as our arguments. And then on the other side is as charitable as possible. This is a very high level of charity, where you say, look, maybe their entire case is completely true. Everything they told you is true. Even so, our arguments are still better. And so these are both doing the same thing, right? At the end, you get the exact same thing. So our arguments are better. Or even so, our arguments are better. Like we are outweighing a version of their arguments. A version of our arguments is better than a version of their arguments. And these are the versions that you should believe are correct. That's the gist of what this line is. And we can go further with this. So for example, I would say like the more charitable you are on this line, the better your weighing is, because it retains that sort of insurance mechanism function to a greater degree, right? You are relying on less and less and less to be true. So there's less and less and less they could do in the next speech, or less and less and less the judge needs to believe for you to be correct and for you to win the debate. For example, if all of your weighing relies on 5 pieces of defense being true, then in their next speech, they could just say, maybe they're right. If all 5 of their pieces of defense are true, then they outweigh our argument. But here's why each of their 5 is not true. If you believe that even one of their 5 is not true, then we win the round. And then it's very easy for them to win. So that's why a less charitable version of their arguments and relying on that for weighing is less effective than a more charitable version of weighing. It's nice to mix them, right? Because the risk with going more and more charitable is that you, in the weighing, are giving up more. And so there's a higher degree of likelihood that you might be wrong about the comparison itself. So, for example, it's just harder to weigh against. If they have a nuclear war scenario and their argument is just really good, it's difficult to find a way to say, even if their nuclear war scenario does happen, our argument is still more important. If your argument is about like poverty, right? It's possible, but it's more difficult. And so, and in the next speech, they might be able to beat your weighing. They might be able to say, obviously not. Our nuclear war scenario is stronger than their poverty scenario. All of their mechanisms are silly. And here's why our scenario is bigger. And so each of these sides have their own risks, but in terms of strategic value, if you can find a way to do the more charitable ones, it's always better because it's relying on less. And there's less they can do to beat you if you're able to prove it. And we can take this to an even greater extreme. We can get even more charitable with it. And this is where you can get the best possible summaries and final focuses that really just put your opponents in a situation that is very difficult to get out of. And this is something I just have not seen in PF. Some very rarely, very, very few teams do this. But I think this is a skill that more teams need to be using and developing in PF because it makes your speeches so much better. If you can find a way to do this, it is so much more clean and convincing when you win. So low charitability is the same as before, right? All of their arguments are way smaller, way less true than they said. That's because we're winning a bunch of defense on them. So clearly they're not as good as our arguments. Our arguments are a better place to vote. All defense is mitigation, all mitigation is weighing. That's the gist of this. Then one step more charitable, we get their entire case is true. Fine. The contention they're going for, it's true. Pretend we don't have any responses. Even so, we outweigh on magnitude. Our impact scenario, it affects more people, it outweighs on scope, and so it's bigger and it's more important. This is where most weighing is in PF nowadays. It's pretty good, but it could be better. So let's explain how it could be better. One way you can get even more charitable, you could say every word in their last speech was true. Let's pretend every word in their last speech was true, including their responses to our arguments. Even accounting for their defense, our arguments are still better. If this is true, if you can pull this off, it's really difficult for them to do anything in their next speech, right? Like they can't say, oh, GG, you conceded this piece of defense. You'll be like, yeah, who cares, right? We accounted for it. So even if the defense is true, it's still the mitigatory capacity of this defense is not enough to bring our argument down lower than yours. Yours is so much lower than ours that even if you cut ours in half, you cut it into thirds or fourths, it's still not as small as your argument is. It's still bigger. And then the maximum, the most charitable you could possibly get. Now you start giving them extra stuff, right? Like even if they ran other arguments that were even better than the ones they ran, even then it wouldn't matter. Even if they gave these other better responses to our arguments, it wouldn't matter. Even if you multiply their arguments by 10, it still wouldn't matter. We still win. Their arguments might even be even better than what they said, but even if that would be the case, our arguments still overcome them. A good example of something that does like the more high charitability side, this is like the one place I think a lot of PFers have started to get there, is like extinction framing, right? The argument goes, our argument is more important because extinction is huge. And that's sort of the middle line, right? Like their entire case is completely true. Even then our arguments are still better because extinction is bigger than their puny impact scenario. But people who are smart using extinction framing will push it into higher layers of charitability. So for example, you can say, even if all of their responses to our extinction scenario are true, as long as you believe there is a 0.1% chance of our extinction scenario happening, which their defense definitely is not enough to get us below. Like their defense is not terminal, it's just mitigatory, right? So even if you believe their defense, even if our argument is incredibly unlikely to happen, as long as you think it's 0.1% chance or so, it's still bigger than their best case impact, which presumably in this case is not extinction. And then you could take it even one step further, right? Like I think I gave a reference to this when I was talking about extinction framing in my extinction video. But sometimes people say like, oh, our argument is like much more probable, right? You can use the math in the extinction calculus. You could be like, even if we multiply the probability of their argument by 1,000,000 times, and even if you think probability is 1,000,000 times more important than magnitude, both of which are nonsensical, but let's pretend that you multiply both of those by 1,000,000. The math still works out for us, even if you give us a 0.1% chance. Just look at the math, look at the card. So even if you give them everything and 1,000,000 times more, they still lose. And then there's just really nothing they can do, right? Like if they're not able to disprove that, there is zero things they could do in their next speech to win the debate. Because there's nothing they can do to, one, get themselves to being 1,000,000 times greater than they originally were, or two, certainly like get more than 1,000,000 times more, like however much deficit you've proven that they're in. So even just like psychologically, I think this is a brilliant strategy because they might as well give up. Like what the heck are you supposed to do against it? The only way you can win is by answering the weighing. And this is how the best weighing should operate, right? Like weighing should be the most important thing in every single debate. It should be the most threatening thing. Like if you don't answer this weighing, you should lose every time, no matter what other things you do on the flow, even if you're great at frontlining, even if you're great at going through the motions. Because, National Circuit PF, you should assume that every one of your opponents is good at going through the motions. They're all going to have lots of offense. They're all going to respond to all of your arguments. They'll dump a bunch of disads in rebuttal. They'll give a bunch of new defense. They will, frontline all of the arguments when they need to. They'll extend everything. If you're debating assuming that they won't do one of those things, then what happens when they do? Like you're gonna hit someone who is able to do it all perfectly, and then what are you gonna do? But the one thing that this is not able to overcome is weighing. You force them to actually think and have good responses, not just responses, and think about why those responses matter in order to overcome the weighing. And sometimes I think that is really the most difficult thing for people to do. And it makes it so much more clear when you are winning in any panel, but especially in front of technical judges. There are too many splits, too many 2-1 splits, 3-2 splits in PF. And this is one way that you can stop those, I think, quite easily. And also, I think judges like this, they will give you way better speaks if you have more charity. It's also just makes sense, right? It's reasonable. It is incorrect that the other side does not have arguments, not only because terminal defense is wrong, but also like some of these resolutions, like it literally is built into it, right? For example, we have resolutions that say like the harms are greater than the benefits or things like that. Like built into that implies that there are harms and there are benefits because there are two sides to every one of these resolutions. It's just incorrect to pretend that there aren't harms or there aren't benefits to one side of the AF. So you should accept that actually there are arguments on both sides. And this is just strictly speaking, like the best way to win is using more and more charitable weighing and seeming much more reasonable in the context of the debate. It's better for lay judges as well, because lay judges don't want you to pretend that every single thing the opponent's saying is wrong when the lay judge has a brain. They can understand that actually there might be some truth to it, even if you have pretty good responses. In the real world, just having pretty good responses does not eliminate an argument from existence because it logically doesn't. It's not just because the real world is so stupid and untechnical. It's because logically it just having a good response does not eliminate the entire truth value of an argument. And so you should debate in the right way that accounts for this fact. Okay. More on charity. Defense clearly works this way as well. It should if it is also weighing. So let's examine that. This is sort of a weird example, and you can actually rearrange it a little bit. It's not sort of perfect, but you could think about it like this, like maybe a no link or no impact argument. If you say that there's both no link and there's no impact, this is very low charitability, right? You're saying their argument is not true or important. If you say, okay, fine, maybe I'm only going to run no link, you can say, even if their argument is true, or even if their argument is important, it's not very true. Or even if their argument is true, no impact, it's not very important. And then a non-unique, I think, is maybe like an example of more charitable. Like even if their argument is both true and important, it mostly happens either way, which means there's not a very high delta between the worlds. And so there's not much of a change. Note all of these are still mitigatory, but they can have different implications that account for more of the truth or importance, or those multiplied together, the risk of their argument. And that has benefits and it has downsides. Maybe the downsides is that it's less and less terminal, right? You are admitting that the implication is not so devastating, but it's also more and more charitable, which means there's less the opponents can do because it accounts for a stronger case of the opponents. This is true within the implications of one response as well. So for example, if we're talking about pharma profits again, and you say pharma profits decrease, I say actually there are 3 reasons why pharmaceutical profits increase they don't decrease. There are a lot of different possible implications. Here are four. One is I could make it the strongest implication technically I could think of, which is like this means companies make a huge net profit, which completely turns their argument and it gives us their impact, gives us new offense. So vote for me. Um, or I could go one layer down and make it slightly higher charity. I could say, fine, if anything, maybe companies don't make a huge net profit, but they might make a little bit of profit on net, which could boost a little bit of research. This probably isn't huge offense for me. I might not go for this as a voter, but it means that if they want to go for this, they're going to have a very hard time because I could still turn it. A third implication, which is now getting much more charitable and much more like realistic, right, is even if companies don't make net profit, at the very least, this cancels out the harms. So there's not any net change. They don't have offense. They don't have a link. And then finally, the most charitable implication of this would be even if companies still lose money on net, so even if there is a link, it's only a tiny bit after you account for the effects that might boost their profits. Like maybe they lose $100 per drug, but they make an extra $90 per drug. They're only losing about $10 on net. And this is not that bad. And then the implication of this is obviously weighing, right? If they're only losing $10 per drug, this is only 10% of your original impact and or your original link. This is makes your impact much smaller compared to ours, which is very big. And so it allows us to do some magnitude weighing or something. You should use these in combination. For example, the best way that you could use this is you could say, look, turn. There are three reasons pharma companies actually make more money from this policy. This means that they actually make a huge net profit, which turns their argument and it gives us new offense on net. But even if you think that they don't make net profit, at the very least, it cancels out their harms. There's no net change or very small net change if they are able to frontline this. And using these together guarantees you the best possible implications downstream. Because if they don't respond to the implications, you can just go for the less charitable one, right? But if they do respond, if they do have a good front line, and they say, actually, this doesn't happen at all, the effect of reducing profit it's better. There's like three reasons to prefer the net decrease over the net increase. Then you can say, fine, they conceded our more charitable implication. There's almost no net change. Even if they have reasons to prefer, the net change is very small. And so this allows us to easily outweigh the argument. And this is just so much stronger than only using the less charitable implication. Because the problem with the less charitable implication is if they just frontline it, there's nothing you could do. Like then they just get access to the full weight of their argument again on the flow. Which is the way that PFers are debating right now. And that's not how it needs to be. Even if they like respond well to your defense, it does not need to be the end of the defense. It might still have lingering implications even when they cut the defense in half. Or they, beat the defense in some way. There's no such thing as completely beating the defense, just like there's no such thing as completely beating the argument. Nothing is terminal. Even frontlines, right? Frontlines don't terminally make up all of the reduction that the defense caused, which means, you got some like lingering effects of the defense. And if you do these high charity implications at the beginning, then it becomes much more difficult for them to frontline and then move on because they can't just move on. They have to respond to the implication as well because your implication accounted for their effective frontlining. All right, that was a lot of words to say. Charitability is important. This is like a new dimension of weighing. We need to think about it. It makes for way cleaner rounds, and you are much more likely to win if you're able to find a scenario in the debate where you do outweigh them with high charity. Okay, now let's talk about some other things that I don't like that much. This is my former PF partner's paradigm, Esme. She really liked meta-weighing. This is an old paradigm. I had roughly the same line in my paradigm back in the day because in our senior year of high school, we did a lot of meta-weighing. We realized, lots of teams, they do weighing. They throw out their mechanisms. I outweigh on magnitude, you outweigh on time frame or something. And then they just stop, and then the judge still has no way to determine who is winning the round because they're just throwing out mechanisms. There's no comparison between the weighing mechanisms. Both teams are doing weighing, but not responding to the other team's weighing or comparing between the weighing. So meta weighing is comparing between the weighing. And I have since turned new leaf. I don't like meta weighing anymore. Sort of for the same reasons that I don't like the generic weighing mechanisms that I listed out earlier. So let's explain meta weighing a little bit first, and then I'll explain why I don't like it. So this is what meta weighing looks like. This is probably the worst meta weighing, is strength of link meta weighing. More common ones are like probability and magnitude, right? So probability is more important than magnitude because if we only focus on magnitude, we would never pass any policy because anything can lead to extinction. I would never shower because there's always a chance I could slip and fall in the shower and die. So we shouldn't only care about magnitude. We should care more about probability. But maybe magnitude matters more than probability because it's more objective, right? You don't really know how likely each of these impact scenarios are. Someone who is living in Iran might have a much higher probability in their mind of how likely they think nuclear war is than you or me. It's subject to cognitive bias, but comparing numbers, that's like, what you're getting. You know which one is bigger, and you know by how much. For example, we don't know if their argument is 30% likely and ours is 40%, but we know we affect 10 million people, they affect 10,000. That's an easy way for you to vote. It's completely objective. You don't have to intervene and think to yourself about how likely you think this is. Also, it doesn't matter if something happens if it has no weight. No one cares if a tree falls in the forest. No one's around to hear it. Does it really make a sound? And we can go on like this, like severity is more important than scope, or scope is more important than severity. Let's just look at a few of these. Scope over severity weighing justifies oppression of minorities for the benefit of the majority because you are prioritizing more people over a greater effect on each person. So you just sacrifice a bunch of people for a very minor gain for more people. But scope over severity is good because it's unethical to compare different people's suffering. You wouldn't do oppression Olympics, and scope is more objective. We can actually compare numbers, but you don't really, whatever. All of this is nonsense. Like, I'm going to be completely real with you. I think this is pretty lazy debate. I think these are pretty lazy ways to compare weighing. For a lot of reasons. One is like, if we think about the practical warrants, like the ones that are like, well, if we used your weighing mechanism, then we would do stupid things in real life. We don't use it in real life. Well, in real life, we don't only use one weighing mechanism for anything. In real life, we use magnitude times probability with all of them feeding into that in some way. And so that seems to like very easily get around it. That's just sort of like utilitarian calculus, which is what policymakers use in real life, at least more than any of this stuff, right? Like no policymaker is thinking about like whether or not probability or magnitude matters more because neither one does. It doesn't make any sense. They're like co-constitutive, right? You can't have probability without magnitude, and you can't have magnitude without probability. Like magnitude without probability is just whoever can say the bigger number. That's not debate. But probability without magnitude is also stupid, right? It's just like whoever can say the more certain outcome, but there's no weight to it, so it sort of also devolves into nothingness. Like, okay, if the policy passes, people will talk about it. It's probably true. Who cares? It's not real debate. We don't even know if that's a good thing or a bad thing because there's no plus or minus magnitude to it. We need magnitude to even know if it's an af or neg argument. So clearly both of them matter. And it's not just that they matter equally. They literally like are part of the same thing. It's like, do you care more about the form or the content? Like they both matter, right? They're both part of the same thing. And so it's sort of nonsense to compare between them, in my opinion. Yes, it can tiebreak rounds. I don't want to completely shut down meta weighing. Like it is a useful tool in your toolkit, but I think there are more useful ways that are more accurate to describe weighing in a debate. What are the more useful ways? Compare how much you are ahead in one of the mechanisms or how much they versus how much they are ahead on the other. So for example, let's say you're in this weird deadlock where they're winning on probability and you're winning on magnitude. You should be comparing the magnitude times probability of both of those. And you don't have a calculator. You don't know what the numbers are. You don't even need quantified magnitudes to do this. You just say, look, we are more ahead on magnitude than they are on probability. Maybe their argument is somewhat more probable than ours. We don't think it's that much more probable, but we're definitely way bigger than theirs on magnitude. This is a difficult thing to do, but that's what you're here to do, right? You're here to do a debate. So you need warrants for those claims, but you should be able to find them in the rest of the flow. It's not an easy thing to do, but with practice, it makes so much more sense than just saying like a one-liner about why probability is better than magnitude. It makes no sense. Okay, so meta-weighing is really utilitarianism. The other warrants that people use for meta-weighing sometimes is like theoretical ones, like maybe it's more educational or something to use magnitude. Or it's more fair is the more common one to use strength of link. For example, muddled arguments require judge intervention, which takes the debate out of the hands of the debaters. It makes it unfair. Conceded links are objectively won, or like the role of the judge is to vote for a good debater, and a good debater is a debater who doesn't concede arguments. And so if they conceded an argument, then you should vote for it. And this is more important. This is like a higher order issue than all of the other weighing because it links it back to theory. It links it back to like why we're doing this debate. And so it's more important than magnitude and probability. That also doesn't make sense, right? Like clearly there are educational and fair things about thinking about arguments in the way that people do in the real world, which is not using strength of link. And there are a lot of terrible things for debate if we just use strength of link. Like, think about what would happen in the debate if we only cared about strength of link. Probably people would just hide random arguments with no probability or magnitude just for them to be conceded. And then it would just be a sort of a terrible mess, I think. I have this sort of thing at the end of the slide, like meta weighing. This is just describing one other problem with meta weighing, which is that, the necessity for meta weighing arose because people use heuristics to compare arguments like time frame and severity. And so you need to compare between those heuristics. But the problem is that meta weighing just introduces new heuristics, right? Like it just meta heuristics, like scope outweighs severity on objectivity, but maybe severity outweighs scope on like the moral relevance. But does moral relevance outweigh objectivity? And so then you sort of need another heuristic to compare between those ones, and you can just keep going up and up and up and up. It just becomes completely absurd, and it just keeps abstracting away from what you're actually talking about, which doesn't seem useful for the debate, doesn't seem useful for anyone, doesn't really seem educational, in my opinion. So yeah, a lot of complaints about meta weighing, but it's takes very little time, and it can be the difference between winning and losing. So I'm not going to judge you if you use it, but there are better ways to beat meta weighing and to do things that are just better than meta weighing. A better model. Okay, I just complained for a very long time about my problems with meta weighing, and also they're tied to my problems with weighing mechanisms in general. A better model than all of this is comparing deltas, because one thing that's left out of all of these like mechanisms and stuff is uniqueness, but not just uniqueness, like the comparison between worlds. If you haven't watched my world comparison lecture, go watch that. It talks a lot about this in depth. But the way that it applies here is in terms of weighing, way too many people in all debate formats, especially policy, and also now especially PF, They just compare concepts, right? You're not really comparing arguments or impacts for that matter. You're comparing the idea of an impact. Um, for example, impact tournaments at camp. I'm sure a lot of you have done them. It's where you go to a lab and like on day 4 of being at camp, they're like, okay, I'm going to give everyone a different impact. You get war, you get cyber attacks, you get a swarm of locusts infests the earth. And then you all are placed in like a bracket and you just take this impact and they have their impact and you just give really small speeches weighing them against each other. This is silly, okay? This is a hot take. This is completely silly. And I think it teaches debaters, specifically in PF, to do just the weirdest, most lazy weighing of just the abstract idea of their impact instead of what their argument actually is. For example, how do you compare war against cyber attacks? Like, do you take the average war against the average cyber attack, but cyber attacks is plural? Does that mean 2 cyber attacks? Does that mean 2,000 cyber attacks? Does that mean the amount of cyber attacks that would happen for the duration that a war would happen? What kind of war are we talking about? Is it a nuclear war? Is it like the, is it like how long of a war? Is it an ancient war? Is it a modern war? Does the war involve cyber attacks? Does that mean they get to steal their impact? But a cyber attack could cause other wars. Does that mean they get to steal their impact? It just devolves into chaos and nothingness because we don't actually know what these impacts are. They have no context behind them whatsoever, which is also feeding the idea that we shouldn't use probability weighing because you're not taught to. You're taught to just compare the terminus, just the impact at the very end. It doesn't make any sense. So here's a better model. This is what you should be using instead. It's more true to what is actually happening in a debate. You are, instead of comparing the concept of an impact, which is just sort of the y-axis here, you should be comparing the net impact, how much of a change there is between the two worlds along that y-axis. So for example, stop comparing climate change to econ. It doesn't make any sense. Climate change does not outweigh the economy, and the economy does not outweigh climate change. They're just ideas. They're just concepts. Neither one is more important. Instead, we should be comparing the actual amount of change caused by the policy in terms of climate change against the actual amount of change caused by the policy in terms of the economy. So for example, does 40 million people falling into poverty outweigh a 0.5% reduction in US carbon emissions? And now we see that this actually has a huge effect on the outcome of these impact wars and these weighing battles. Because when originally it might have been incredibly difficult for the econ impact to outweigh the climate impact, right? Climate change, one, it's probably the case that climate change affects the economy more than the economy affects climate change. So it's difficult to try to take the sneaky route and steal the climate impact by saying like, oh, we need a better economy to invest more in renewable energy. One probably goes the opposite direction. Historically, a better economy leads to worse emissions, not better emissions. But two, like obviously warming decks the economy much more permanently than any economic fluctuations that otherwise would happen would be. So you're not going to win that way. You're not going to win on magnitude because warming, like it's more of a matter of life and death for most people. Like it really destroys people's lives. It has a more direct link into death than the economy. You get, bit by the reversibility weighing as well, which I guess is like a proxy for severity, which is a proxy for magnitude. So it's hard to compare econ to climate change. But it is easier to compare 40 million people in poverty against a 0.5% reduction in US carbon emissions. Now we actually have a tangible thing to compare. And we realize that this warming impact does not actually get to leverage the full weight of warming, right? There are 200-ish other countries that are still going to be producing emissions, even if you influence them somewhat with modeling, like setting an example. There are all of the emissions that already exist. You're not really changing your emissions very much with this policy. And this is a very, very easy way to beat like 90% of warming impacts. Um, like, look, it's difficult to say warming doesn't cause extinction. To be fair, it's difficult to say warming does cause extinction. We don't really know. There are tail end risks. It is very easy to say that this one policy will not be the difference between whether or not warming will cause extinction or not. And it's not because warming inevitable, non-unique, terminal. Obviously not, right? It's scalar, clearly. Maybe it's even exponentially scalar. But it is because one policy is not going to make that much of a difference. One policy in one country, it's not going to make that much of a difference. This is not doomerism, right? Like it is important for us to do this policy. It actually might make a good amount of difference, but it's not going to be solving warming. That's just not realistic. And if you crunch the numbers, this is sufficient to beat like the vast majority of warming arguments, especially if their strategy is to go for extinction. For example, on the high-speed rail topic a few years ago, this was a strategy that I prepped for some of my students. Like, I just found a card that said like, you need like a trillion plus tons of CO2 in the atmosphere to change the temperature by like 1 degree. And then we would just take the highest numbers of the amount of CO2 that would be offset by high-speed rail over like decades. And it would be like 10 million or like 100 million. And so then we would just be like, okay, look, the highest numbers, the absolute highest numbers that assume all of your argument is true. Again, this is like charitability, right? Only allow you to get access to a 0.1 degree warming difference, which is not enough to access any of your impact scenarios. Like if we actually do the multiplication with your impact scenarios, like what's the common card? It's like every 0.5 degree of warming kills like 150 million people. Well, then a 0.1 degree of warming, that kills 1/5 of that, which is like quick maths. That is like 30 million people, which means you can outweigh that. Like you can outweigh that, right? Like your war scenario, it maybe kills 100 million people or 50 million. Like these are numbers that are able to be outweighed. It suddenly becomes realistic. So this is, I think, a very, very good strategy to use. It's just recognizing that they don't get to leverage the full concept of their impact. So if you ever feel like you're behind on weighing, just think along these lines and you will find something that you can use. Be as charitable as possible. Again, right? Like even their highest numbers, even if we multiply their highest numbers by 10, it still wouldn't be the dent that their impact scenario is talking about. Whatever. This allows you to get much more sophisticated weighing that they're less likely to be prepared for. Okay. The next half of this lecture or so is going to be about some more technical nuances of how weighing works in a debate and how debate rounds are judged. I think I'll probably record it as a part 2 because this is getting quite long. But it's really the meat and potatoes of this entire lecture. So in part 2, I'll talk about the win by one model of debate. I'll talk about some very interesting ways to think about how debate works in a debate round, or how weighing works in a debate round, and how judges actually account for weighing in practice and how they should account for weighing in their decisions. Then I will talk about a bunch of different types of weighing. So things like framing, structural violence, extinction, a little bit. I've already talked about extinction. And I'll talk a lot about non-utilitarian calculus. So things like philosophical frameworks that are not consequentialist, for instance, things like deontology, how you can use them in debate to win. Because I know some teams have been using like Kant recently. So that's what will come next time when I release part 2 of this lecture. But yeah, hopefully this was interesting. And thanks for watching.